Greetings from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I'm Karen Christensen, talking to colleagues around the world about topics that I write about at Karen's Letter. We often talk about books. Sustainability is always a focus. I latched onto this saying, think globally, act locally, when I was very young. And it sums up what you'll find at this podcast about the way we live now.
Well, about 15 years ago, I suppose, I was writing a book about the Yangtze and spent a year just about traveling upstream from Shanghai to where it rises in Galandandong in Tibet. And when I got back to New York to write it, I was writing the chapter on the Three Gorges. Specifically, I was interested to know how junk, before the advent of power in the early part of the 20th century, how a sailing junk would have managed to get up through the ferocious currents in the 300-odd miles of the Three Gorges against the stream. I mean, the boats had to be very capacious and light. They took an enormous amount of cargo between Wuhan and Chongqing. But what did they look like in the Ming and the Qing dynasties? And someone who knew a lot about ships said to me, well, there are two classic books that you must look at. One is The Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze by G.R.G. Worcester, published in Annapolis in 1942. And the other was Volume 4, Part 3 of Science and Civilization in China by Joseph Needham. Now, I hadn't heard of either of these books, nor either of these writers, but I think that conversation must have taken place on a Friday. And the following day, a Saturday, I was up in Salisbury, Connecticut, where there was an absolutely wonderful bookstore called Lion's Head Book, which is one of those, a bookstore that has everything, run by a very knowledgeable bookseller called Mike McCabe. The bookstore is now defunct, but Mike, I'm happy to say, is not defunct at all. But he was one of these booksellers who knew every book, it seemed, that had ever been published. And so I went up on Saturday morning and I said, Mike, I've got two rather obscure books. I wonder if at least you could know where I might get hold of them or whether you can order them for me. He said, okay, try me. And I said, well, the first one is called The Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze. And he said, oh, you mean G.R.G. Worcester? And I said, yes, I think I do. And he said, yes, well, we normally have that in stock. See, it wasn't a maritime bookstore at all, but it was a very large format book. And he reached up from an upper shelf and pulled it down, $25. And I said, you're an amazing guy, Mike. Well, what's the second one? And he said, the second one, I said, I'm looking for Volume 4, Part 3 of something called Science and Civilization in China. And he looked at me as if his expression completely changed. He looked as if I was something that the cat had dragged into the store. He said, you do, of course, mean Joseph Needham. And I said, I think that is the name, yes. And he said, are you telling me you've never heard of Joseph Needham? And I said, I'm afraid I haven't. And he said, well, you ought to be thoroughly ashamed of yourself, because he is the most famous Englishman ever to have lived in China. He wrote this extraordinary series of books, 20-odd volumes, I don't know how many, but an enormous series of books, completely changed the way, single-handedly, that the West thought of China. And he said, we never get complete sets. It's still in print, Cambridge University Press. It would cost thousands, but we occasionally get single volumes, and I think I remember one coming in a couple of years ago. So he, like the White Rabbit, disappeared down into his lair in the bottom of the shop and came back a few moments later with this enormous fat tome. He blew the dust off it, held it up to the light, Science and Civilization in China by Joseph Needham, Volume 4, Part 3, the very one that I wanted, $75. So I just blessed him for existing and thought independent bookstores are wonderful things. Gave him a $100 bill, went out to the car, and it was pretty obvious what Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze was about, but what was Volume 4, Part 3, this massive book, and I cracked it open in the car and sat completely enthralled for an hour, 984 pages. Everything you'd ever want to know about China's historic relationship with water. So it was about the building of the Grand Canal and the design of rudders and navigation techniques at sea and the use of the compass and charts and the varied diagrams of the Ming and Qing sailing junks that went up the Yangtze. Absolutely everything. And I thought, my God, who was this person who put this book together? And if what Mike McCabe had said was to be believed, not just this volume, but 20-odd other volumes about astronomy and biology and chemistry and engineering and mathematics and metallurgy, who was he? And I thought to myself, one day I would try and have a crack at writing a book about him. But I'm not a sinologist. I speak barely any Chinese. But I sort of kept it at the back of my mind. And then after I'd finished a book on the San Francisco earthquake in 2006 and realizing that 2008 was going to be the Olympic year when possibly there would be some piqued interest in us as Chinese, I thought I might have a go. So by this time I'd identified the keepers of the flame, of the Needham flame, which is an institute in Cambridge, the Needham Research Institute. And I wrote to them and I said, writer who lives in America, and I'm fascinated by this chap, and but I'm not a sinologist, and I know that sinologists are fairly, they certainly regard their skill somewhat justly. As it happened, the director, a man called Christopher Cullen, had read a book of mine, The Professor and the Madman, about the making of the Oxford English Dictionary, a similarly sort of epic project. And he thought that works very well, and he said, I think this would be a capital idea. So, yes, the trustees, I'll put it to them, they said yes, and so I went over to the NRI and to the University in Cambridge and started work on this extraordinary archives that they have that Joseph kept. Basically, essentially, his diaries, which were had a beautiful writing hand. His entire story was laid out for me really quite easily in a way. So he turned out to be every bit as fascinating and remarkable a character as the books that he wrote. He was born in London in 1900, although how he was conceived, I don't quite know, because his parents completely and cordially loathed each other. So his father was a rather ascetic doctor, also called Joseph. He was an anesthetist or anesthesiologist, as we say here. Wife number one died, but his second wife was, as far as one can see, completely insane. She was a drunkard. She sang at inappropriate moments. She went like a drunken sailor. She threw crockery and knives. She was very violent. She was Irish and French, which I'm sure had nothing to do with this insanity. How they managed to have the necessary 30 minutes or so of peace and quiet to conceive a child, I don't know, but they must have done sometime around Easter 1900, because just before Christmas there was born to them this small child, and their disagreement continued to the font. Joseph wanted to call the child Noel because he was born at Christmas time, and mother, for some obscure Irish reason, wanted to call it Terence. And so in the end they called him Noel Joseph Terence Montgomery Needham, and the little boy called himself Joseph, just out of a spirit of filial compromise. And he would spend most of his early life up in the fourth floor nursery in their house in Clapham, being looked after by a rather gloomy French governess. But she taught him French, and indeed language became a very early thing that he was very adept at, such that by the time he was 13, I think, he could speak and read and write. I think it was 7 languages. So, I mean, it was Latin and Greek. Obviously, he couldn't speak Latin, but he could read and write Greek and Latin. But French and German and Spanish, and also Polish and Russian, which is no mean achievement, having both rather difficult languages. And he also picked up rather other somewhat unusual skills. He became very good at driving steam railway trains. He loved railway trains, and he learned how to do this. His father had a lot of strange friends, and there was one, a surgeon, a very flamboyant surgeon called Sir John Bland Sutton, who came to the house frequently. He was a great friend of Kipling, and so Kipling came to the house a lot. But Bland Sutton was a surgeon who, among other things, invented the hysterectomy. And he used to have young Joseph round the operating theatre to help him perform operations and hand him catguts and scalpels and things, something I imagine liability lawyers like the people finding this building wouldn't look too kindly on. But anyway, it meant that Joseph became very, very familiar with the nether regions of ladies, which was described in very good stead later in his life. The Van Sutton was also interested in another thing, rather more peculiar. He was very interested in the lemur, the Madagascan primate. The lemur apparently has a predisposition to cataract. Who knew, but apparently they do. Van Sutton would perform surgery, pro bono, one imagines, on afflicted lemurs, and would invite Joseph to attend the operations. So by the time he was sort of 16, he could speak 7 languages. He drive steam railway trains. He had a profound knowledge of the interior workings of women and of optionally challenged lemurs. So he was clearly destined for a rather glittering academic career. He was also much affected by the mantras which his father would sing up all around the house. One of them I mean, I'd heard of none of them, but one of them affects me very much to this day, which was never go upstairs empty-handed. I find that I can't see a staircase now without desperately looking for something to carry up it. Never have 3 helpings of anything. You can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. No knowledge is ever to be wasted or despised, which I think is very sensible. And when he went up to Arundel School in Northamptonshire, just north of London, the headmaster there, a remarkable educationalist, remarkable enough to have his own biography. He was called F.W. Sanderson, written by H.G. Wells, so he was a rather formidable character. He also pumped Needham full of aphorisms, of which the most notable was, my boy, he said, put aside the pettifogging and the little details, think big, think in oceans, which I think is a lovely mantra. And this clearly did remain with Needham all his life, as you'll see. Well, he went up to Cambridge. He breezed in because he was so clever. He went to Caius College, which the college made famous by the film Chariots of Fire, which I expect most of you have seen. And he went up initially to read medicine, but he was swiftly told that, and I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying so, that medicine was a very non-intellectual pursuit, and that the future, my boy, another mantra, lies in atoms and molecules, and so he switched to chemistry. And he got a passing third degree in chemistry, good enough to allow him to go to a PhD in biochemistry. And the Institute of Biochemistry in Cambridge at the time was run by a remarkable man called Frederick Nowland Hopkins, who went on to win the Nobel Prize for the discovery of vitamins in 1928. So the Institute was clearly a very sort of leading edge, bleeding edge, cutting edge kind of place. And Needham, then his mind really began to expand, and people noted him as a polymathic kind of figure, the Erasmus of his age, someone remarked. So he got his PhD fairly swiftly, and at a very early age, only 24, he was elected to a fellowship at Caius, which meant that his academic position was secure really for the rest of his life. He didn't have to worry. He had a beautiful room, which he was to keep for the next 75 years. A room which he inherited. It's in the, I don't know if you know Caius, but in the main court, staircase K, room 1, ground floor. Used to be a zoologist, a man called Sir William Bake Hardy, and he died, and Needham took it over when he was elected to the fellowship. And when Needham died in 1995, it passed to the person who occupies it today, which is the cosmologist Stephen Hawking. So it's a rather nice illustration of the continuity of intellectual life at Cambridge. So Needham then began research on something which he probably would have continued work on for the rest of his days, which was the egg. He was an embryologist, working out how something made of shell and albumin and white transforms itself into feathers and beaks and blood and whatever chickens are made of. And so that's what he did. And it was during this period that the eccentricities for which he's become known started to develop. Some of them not eccentricities. But essential parts of his character. He was much affected in 1917 by the Bolshevik Revolution and became a Marxist, never a card-carrying member of the party, but very, very determinedly and militantly left-wing, and he always was for the rest of his life. But he was very much a builder of bridges between his mother and father, between East and West, between China and the outside world, and between Marxism and one of its opposites, which is, of course, Christianity. And he became a very, very keen and sincere Christian. Had some difficulty finding a church with a left-wing fence, but he did in the end. He found one in a village outside Cambridge called Saxted, which was run by a remarkable left-wing vicar called Conrad Noel, who was himself rather eccentric. He used to preach his sermons with a parrot on his shoulder and would do sort of mischievous things like run the flag of Sinn Féin up to the top of the steeple just to show solidarity with Irish Home Rule, and this would prompt some right-wing louts from Cambridge to come down and climb up the steeple and pull the offending flag down, and that meant the police were called and there were riots in this village. And Needham thought it was absolutely wonderful. So he was also an early, he espoused something which in the 1920s was given the polite name of gymnosophy. This was the word for nudism. He loved taking his clothes off at every possibility from a socialist point of view, that when you divest yourself of your silks and satins, you are at one with your fellow man, or minus the two bits, with your brother or sister female. So he took his clothes off all the time. On the encouragement of Conrad Noel's wife, he became a very keen practitioner of Morris dancing, which I don't know if and a very big expert on it, this bizarre form of pagan dancing where you attach straw and bells to your wrists and ankles and dance around, gyrate rather than dance, by beating sticks together, and someone plays a tune that's dirged on a pipe. Naturally, he doesn't seem to have performed this naked. So he did also take up and became very good at playing the accordion. Someone mentioned to me early on that, thank God, being a nudist, he didn't take up the cymbals, but I said the accordion would do much the same, only rather than more slowly. He was also a chain smoker all his life, and he lived till 95, but he always ascribed his longevity to the fact that he never smoked a cigarette before noon. He balanced the cigarette on his desk, and when the clock in the court of Cleves, which played such a part in Chariots of Fire, struck the final bell, he picked it up and lit it and smoked like industrial Manchester for the rest of the day. And he was also, and this is a rather important point to say, he was also an avowed and unrepentant and committed womanizer. He loved women, and they loved him. He was very tall and handsome in a sort of Harry Potterish way. He looked like, with those spectacles, he looked like the Harry Potter on amphetamines. And the Institute of Biochemistry was fed by someone full of clever Jews and talkative young women, and he loved the Jews. He really loved the women, and he worked his way through most of them until he settled on one daughter of a Quaker from Devon. She was called Dorothy Moyle, and while he was working on the eggs, she was working on the mechanics of muscles, what happens when you flex them. And they courted and eventually married on Friday the 13th of September in a sort of flouting convention. And he made this speech, the reception, which I think somewhat surprised Dorothy, in which he said, "Our idea is to be a thoroughly modern marriage, not to be hidebound by the rather tedious conventions of bourgeois fidelity and things like that. So if either of us has friends, extracurricular friends, that's to be certainly condoned and perhaps even encouraged." Well, looking at her diaries, which were in Girton College, Cambridge, there's no evidence at all that she ever strayed from the path of marital rectitude, but the same cannot be said of Joseph, who, from the moment they returned from their honeymoon, seems to have hit the ground running, and few Cambridge women were free from his attentions. But I interviewed quite a lot of them, and they're all in their 80s and 90s now, and they look back on it with tremendous affection. They say he was, yes, he seduced, but he was lovely about it and totally. So it began, therefore, to look, once the marriage had settled down, that the life of Dorothy and Joseph would unroll in a fairly predictable, left-wing Christian, Morris dancing, nudist, chain-smoking way. It would have done, I think, except for something that happened of huge importance in 1937. Joseph, thinking in oceans, produced a massive book in 1930 of 3 volumes on chemical embryology. I mean, it's figure as Karen and Celia as an ocean thinker, producing massive books. It's still around. Joseph Needham on chemical embryology is the classic. Go to AV books and you'll find it. But then what happened in 1937 changed everything, because there suddenly arrived in Cambridge from Nanjing a young, fiercely clever, rather attractive and petite woman called Lu Guizhen to study for a PhD under Dorothy. The Needhams had become very well known in left-wing circles in China because of their support for the anti-fascist side in the Spanish Civil War. And Guizhen, who was the daughter of a pharmacologist in Nanjing, had read about them and decided she wanted to do a PhD somewhere in the West in biochemistry. Cambridge Institute was famous because of Hopkins, and the Needhams were famous because of their left-wing stance. So she applied, was accepted, came over on a boat in August 37 from Shanghai to London, took the train up to Cambridge, met Dorothy, and then Dorothy said, "You better go down the hall and meet my husband, Joseph." And she thought he was this little old wizened, grey-haired man with a sort of chemical-stained love shirt. Not at all. There was this tall, buoyant, rather handsome, Harry Potterish figure, and she was completely enraptured by him, and he was completely enraptured by her. And they began an affair which was to be hugely important for all of their lives. And the mechanics of the affair can be spelled out in great detail and outwhere in the diary. And it proceeded relatively sort of courteously and wasn't consummated until February of 1937. But you see how it develops through the diaries. But the day it was consummated is sort of worth lingering on briefly for non-prurient reasons, I promise you. It was the 17th of February 1938. The day begins in the diary. Every time Joseph referred to his wife in his diary, he always, for some reason, wrote about her in Greek. And so there is a sentence. I didn't read Greek at all at school. And there's a sentence in Greek, which it took me a long time to decipher, which says, Dorothy to Babatum. Babatum is the village in Devon that she came from. And clearly, I'm sure Babatum has never been written in Greek in its entire history, but here it is. So she's clearly sent to Babatum to meet her parents or something. So the coast is clear. Joseph is alone in Cambridge with the woman of his dreams. So he does a number of things. First of all, he takes her to a movie which has just opened, and everything is in his diaries, the theatre stubs and the restaurant receipts and so forth. So he takes her to the film which has just opened, and that is The Good Earth, told about film, which you would think, a young woman plucked from Nanjing would find this film certainly produce nostalgia. One might, if one was cynical about Joseph's motives, suggest that it would also make her somewhat pliant. Well, to reinforce this pliancy, Joseph then took her to the most expensive restaurant in Cambridge of the day, which is an Italian restaurant called the Venetian, and it's clear from the receipts that wine was taken in considerable quantity. And obviously reinforcing her pliancy. And then he took her back to his rooms in Keys, to Stephen Hawking's room to be. And then in the diary, there are 3 asterisks, which, if you're a person of normally prurient mind, you would imagine that clearly something happened. Maybe something happened 3 times. But anyway, it's not that so much that's important. What is important is that immediately after the 3 asterisks, you see first in pencils, and then as he grows more confident, committed to ink, the first Chinese character that Joseph ever writes in his life. And I often ask people, if we don't have time, what they think that character was. And people come up with love and wow, someone said whatever Chinese the wow is, or clouds and rain, that rather nice euphemism for having sex. But it was none of those. It was much more prosaic, but actually, when you think about it, perfectly logical. It was the 2 characters, actually, for cigarette. Those of you that have seen Now Voyager, you can just imagine that scene, those 2 cigarettes. And they both smoked players' Navy cut cigarettes. So after the 3 asterisk event was over, he clearly reached his bedside table, took 2 cigarettes, both passed one to Grey Gem, inhaled, exhaled, rolled the cylinder of tobacco between his finger and thumb, turned to her and said, Grey Gem, how do I write this in Chinese? And she showed him. And he then wrote, it's a beautiful sentence. He said it was suddenly as if a door opened into an utterly alien universe, and I stepped through it into the glittering crystalline world of Chinese ideographic writing, and I was never to be the same person again. And he wasn't. Nothing was the same from that moment on. She taught him Chinese. He thirsted, he hungered for it. He employed the help of the then professor of Chinese at Cambridge, called Gustav Halun. Between the 2 of them, they hammered away at him, and by 1941, he had impeccable photographic memory. He could read and write and perform pretty elegant calligraphy as well, 5,500 characters. He could speak it, but in a sort of slightly cumbersome way that many of us Westerners have. Not least because he was the only Chinese he would speak to, and the professor of Chinese was Czechoslovakia and had a very Hungary or something, and had a very peculiar accent. But nonetheless, he had this profound knowledge of Chinese. He could speak it. He loved Chinese. He loved the Grey Gem, but he loved China. So everything about his life was predicated on his hopes that he would sooner or later get to China. Well, consider the situation of China in the 1940s, the early 1940s, a country which was still very much regarded with disdain by most in the West. I mean, the remark of Emerson a century before, this booby nation, the country stood for only ceramics and silk and tea and rhubarb, and that was about it. No major importance on the world scene, peripherals of civilization. Ever since 1841, being shooed away by foreign powers, the revolution of 1910, the warlordism and all that sort of stuff. Since 1933 or 1937 had been invaded by and was now in a full-scale war with the Japanese. I mean, China was in a hopeless mess. And one of the things that had happened, which of course you all know about, was the exodus of an awful lot of universities in the late 1930s from the east of China, that was now occupied by the Japanese, of course, to the relative safety of the West. And universities in places like Nanjing and Beijing would go with all their students and blackboards and Bunsen burners and books and things, and end up in places like Kunming and Chengdu and Chongqing, relatively safe cities. And in 1942, these universities sent deputation to London to plead with the British government to help them, because Chinese intellectual life was being suffocated. The Japanese on the east and the Govians and the west, that they were getting no supplies, no books, no papers, no equipment. But the British and the Americans maintained an air bridge from Calcutta to Kunming. So could the government help supply them with what they needed? And Winston Churchill himself signed off on the memo, which said, yes, we, the British, should send an emissary to see what the Chinese universities need. And the person that they chose was not a career diplomat at all, was an academic. He was this tall, ebullient, exuberant, Chinese-speaking biochemist from Cambridge, Joseph Needham. And so he was in 1942, in the autumn, put on a convoy, sent to Calcutta. In early 1943, he was given a military uniform and a gun. I mean, he had never had a gun in his life before. He was going off to a war zone, and put on a plane, Calcutta Dum Dum to Assam. And then on March the 17th, 1943, he arrived in Kunming, where happened the second great epiphany of his life. I should back up for a moment and say that shortly, once he had got the appointment to come to China, he came here to New York, because Guizhen, oddly enough, was teaching at Columbia, living on Haven Avenue, up way in the far north of Manhattan. And he came to see her, and that, I mean, getting here, wartime was very difficult, flying boats from Ireland to Brazil and so forth. But he saw her, and she made this speech to him, in which she said, you Westerners have such an arrogant attitude towards China. You know, you think we're worth nothing. You think we're peripheral to civilization, whereas I know in my heart and my father that we're central to the construction of the world's civilization. When you go there, I want you to promise me that you will just keep an open mind. Don't have the normal Western attitude to China. And this very much stayed with him, as is evidenced, I think, by this little but terribly important thing that's happened on the very first day he got there. So 17th of March, that's 1943, he's in Kunming. He gets off the plane. He goes to the British consul, a man called Alvin Ogden. He has a bath. And then he walks through this town, which is full of all the images that he dreamed of, you know, the architecture and the people and the clothing. Everyone was friendly and nice. Brilliant, crisp, early spring day, the hills of Tibet in the distance with snow on them. Sat in a garden, smoking, of course, watching an old Chinese gardener, as he wrote in a little Mongol cap, top grafting a plum tree. And he sat there watching him idly, and then with more concentration, he suddenly realized that the way that this man was grafting the tree was significantly different from the way that he remembered his father grafting an apple tree in their back garden in Clapham in London. And he thought he'd ask the man what he was doing. And of course, he could speak somewhat Chinese, and so he found the man could indeed understand him, and he could understand the replies, and he asked him questions. And then he went back to the botanical archives at the university in Kunming, and he found he could read all the old documents. And then he started sending diplomatic telegrams to the departments of botany in London and Oxford and Cambridge. And the upshot of all this was that a week later, he was able to prove incontrovertibly that Chinese fruit grafting techniques were at least 6 centuries older than any grafting techniques known to botanists in the Western world. They were previously thought to have been originated in ancient Greece. Not at all. They were much older, and they were Chinese. And this gave him the stimulus, the impetus to say, I am going to, impelled by what Guizhen has said to me up on Haven Avenue, sure, I'll do what the British government wants me to do. I'll find out what these universities want and supply it to them, but I will start asking questions and collecting books and interrogating people to come up with a list of Chinese first, to put it as its crudest. And so he did, and the list began to accumulate very rapidly, finding out, I mean, the classic one, of course, is Francis Bacon's famous remark about the things that the most identified modern man, the use of printing and gunpowder and the use of the compass, which And Bacon made the remark, it's assumed they were European or Levantine, but not at all. Needham was able to prove definitively that the world's oldest book is 868 AD, the Diamond Sutra, 600 years before Saxon and Gutenberg, that the compass was used in the East China Sea 300 years before it appeared in the Levant, and that gunpowder, which arrogantly we assumed, if it was a Chinese invention, was only used for trivial things like celebratory fireworks, would actually have been used for fragmentation bombs and cannons and mortars in the 7th century AD. So the list accumulated, as I say, very rapidly. I mean, the theorem for suspension bridges, blast furnaces, conditioning fans, vaccination against smallpox, toilet paper, for heaven's sake. I mean, if we do think of toilet paper at all, I imagine we assume it's a Victorian invention. But he was able to find, 1341, I think was the relevant date, sheets of soft, perfumed paper for this very purpose, 3 feet by 2 feet, which sounds a bit improbably large, but also smaller ones, 6 inches by 3 for the apparently more delicately shaped posteriors of the Asian aristocracy, were on sale in the 14th century. At the same time as this list, which went on hundreds of items, he then also became seized with the puzzling notion of, well, if the Chinese had invented so much so early, why did it suddenly seem to stop this energy in about 1550? What happened? Why did modern science then transfer to the West? Why? It can prove, he said, that there was a Chinese Euclid and there was a Chinese Archimedes, but why was there never a Chinese Copernicus or a Chinese Galileo or indeed a Chinese Einstein? And this became the Needham question. So he traveled all over China for all of the years of the war under very arduous conditions, based in Chongqing, which of course was then the capital. And I, in researching the book, followed in his footsteps and had all sorts of adventures myself. He then, when the war was over, I mean, he traveled Chongqing to Dunhuang, Chongqing down to the Burmese border, up to Fuzhou in the East China Sea, and then when the war was over, up to Xi'an and Beijing. And then came back once the war was over, stopping for a couple of years in Paris to help found UNESCO. And it's interesting that he was said to be called, this body was simply called UNESCO, the United Nations Educational and Cultural Organization, but he argued very vocally that science belonged to the world as a whole. So he managed to get it called UNESCO. So if he had never gone on to do anything great, Joseph Needham would always be the man that put the S in UNESCO. Anyway, he got to Cambridge in 1948. Very enthusiastic about this idea. He wrote to Cambridge University Press, 15th of May, I think it was 1948, to say, I want to write a book called Science and Civilization in China. It will be 1 volume and it will take me 1 year. Well, rather like James Murray in the OED, who woefully underestimated the task. But in 3 months, he said, well, maybe actually 3 volumes, and then a year later, well, maybe 5, and maybe 7. 7 years, but maybe volumes 4 of those 7 can be divided into 3 parts, maybe 5 parts. Anyway, by the time he died, in 1995, he himself had authored essentially 17 volumes, 3.5 million words. The 25th volume came out last year on metallurgy, so it's now 4.5 million words. The longest book on China in the English language ever written. And as I say, a book which changed that view from the pointless periphery of civilization view to the view we have now, which is awe and admiration and just a degree of theater, I respect, certainly. Looking at the clock, and I know you're going to suddenly start saying something. Well, I want to say 2 things. But
no, but you want to go on.
Well, I just want to say just 2 things. One, both of them on a sort of personal note. One, what happened to his family? Well, Dorothy remained grimly smiling through it. A classic complacent wife. They remained married for. She died in 1987, and they were married when she died. But he then married Gui Jin, who had been waiting patiently in the wings for 51 years. When she died, she was not a well woman, she died 800 days later. He then, the old goat, wrote 3 further letters to 3 further women, saying, I'm actually now available, I guess. Very, very sensibly, because he was clearly beginning to creep a little, turned him down. So he lived his last few years as a bachelor. The Queen gave him the Companionship of Honor in 1992, which is the highest civilian award the Queen can bestow. And then he died in 1995. And the ashes of the 3, because they were known as the Needham, they all loved each other and Cambridge knew them very well. So Dorothy, Gui Jin, and Joseph, ashes together, buried in the grounds of the Needham Research Institute under, fittingly, of course, a plumber fee. The other thing I want to say, make 2 points, which is that although not, I mean, obviously very well known here, but generally in both America and Britain, very little known. If you mention Joseph Needham, people would look at you rather blankly. In China, every educated Chinese knows who Li Yuzhe is, the Chinese name. And this little story illustrates that, but also it talks a little about his belief in the coming primacy of China. Well, it happened about 2 years ago. I was my wife, producer at National Public Radio, had at the time an apartment in Washington, D.C., in Adams Morgan. And we were there. She had a program to do the next day. So we decided not to go out to dinner nor to cook, but to send out for Chinese food. So there's Mr. Chen's Organic Chinese Restaurant on Connecticut Avenue. Sounds something of a contradiction in terms, but nonetheless, we rang them, we ordered the food we wanted, and were told it would be delivered in 45 minutes. Sure enough, 8:30, doorbell rings, small Chinese man, 2 plastic bags. We pat our pockets and realize to our horror, chagrin and embarrassment, we don't have enough money. The bill is $40. We've got $7 in cash. He doesn't take credit cards. But he's very relaxed about it. And he said, there's an ATM down in the street. So he gave my wife the food and she started unpacking it and laying the table. I got my ATM card. And I went down the corridor to get the lift to go down to the street. But the lift wouldn't come for some funny technical reason. And I had to talk to this chap, and I said, where are you from? And he said, Shanghai, and I knew Shanghai reasonably well, so we talked a bit about Shanghai. Keep on pressing the button, the lift still wouldn't come, so I have to now engage in rather more conversation. So I suddenly remembered what I was doing, and I said, I'm writing a book about Joseph Needham. And he looked completely uninterested in this revelation. But then I said, Li Yuzhe. And he came alive. He said, my God, you're writing a book about Li Yuzhe. And I said, you've heard of him? He said, of course I have. Every educated Chinese has heard. I mean, he told the whole world about Chinese achievement. He wrote this massive book, and it's the most famous Englishman ever lived. I said, this is wonderful. I want to have you stuffed and mounted. I mean, the one sale I'm likely to have. And I said, back in the apartment, I have books and photographs and diary entries. Would you like? Yeah, I'd love to. So I came, my wife somewhat surprised that I'm bringing a delivery guy back, because this man knows Joseph Needham. Well, so I showed him these things, but after a few minutes, she said quite wisely, she said, no, I think he just really wants his money. He's just being... I said, you're absolutely right. So I went back, and this time the lift came, and we went down to the street, went to the ATM, got him his money, gave him his chip, and I just said, it's been wonderful meeting you. I mean, I've been laboring on this for hours, and I didn't realize anyone knew who he was, but you do, you're great. Anyway, lovely to meet you. The book's coming out next May. Goodbye. And I walked back to the apartment, and as I was walking back, I heard footsteps behind me in Washington. I looked over my shoulder, but it was the delivery guy walking in lockstep about 5 paces behind me, because clearly he had parked his car or his bike near the entrance to the apartment. So even though the conversation was officially over, it seemed churlish not to continue. So I said, by the way, when you lived in Shanghai, what did you do? And he said, I used to work in the computer department at the Standard Chartered Bank. So I knew this one very trivial fact about the history of the Standard Chartered Bank in Shanghai, that it used to be called in the 19th century Macaulay's Bank, and it's known colloquially to many people as Macaulay Bank. So I said, oh, Macaulay Bank. And he stopped dead in the middle of Columbia Road and fixed me with a stare and said, Simon? And I looked at him and I said, Thornton? I made a film about this guy for the BBC 20 years before. And we stood there hugging each other in the street. He was in tears. And I remember all the details. It all came back to me. What we were doing 10 BBC films on the last 10 years from 87 to 97. And one of the devices we had chosen was to compare the lives of a banker in Hong Kong with a banker in Shanghai and see how they might converge year by year. The banker in Hong Kong, with a typical Hong Kong banker, lived in Repulse Bay, had a BMW, a wife that looked like a model to be accommodating for chefs in Bali. The guy in Shanghai, this man, Gordon, Choi Guo-hong, fifth-floor walk-up, cabbages, coal dust, rusty bicycle, wife assembled radio sets in a factory somewhere. I had filmed him in 1987. In 1988, I got him a visa to come to Hong Kong. He had never been to meet his opposite number. And in 89, he had come to me and said, the future of the world belongs to America. I want to go to America. So I sponsored him for his visa. I paid his first term's tuition at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And in September of that year, 1989, I put him on a plane at Hongqiao Airport, as it was then, in Shanghai, a Northwest Airlines flight to Minneapolis with a connection to Philadelphia, and never saw him again until 20 years later. He comes here delivering Chinese food. So naturally, I took him back up to the apartment with my wife. Completely. I said, I know this man. He's a close friend of mine. He said, why doesn't he just come and live here? So anyway, he was very sensitive, and he said, look, I know you want to leave now. Also, I imagine you've got some questions you want to ask. But look, I'll ring my wife. And he was streaming to it. He rang his wife. And then she said, all right, we want to take the two of you out to dinner for the weekend. So we went to dinner, and he told us his story. He said that he had indeed lost his PhD. He had taken advantage of a Canadian government scheme which offered citizenship to PhDs from China. So he went up to Toronto. He brought his wife over from Shanghai. They settled down with Canadian citizenship. He worked for General Motors of Canada. In 1999, he accepted a job in Rockville, Maryland, working for a communications company, doing a sort of secret communications protocol, which he was very much a computer with. But 2001, September the 11th, all non-American citizens were summarily fired. But he was allowed to remain in the country. He had official Microsoft and Oracle qualifications, and he set himself up as a consultant. But during this period, he underwent a sort of sea change in his view of the world. And he came to believe that instead of being an anonymous Chinese guy living in Washington, if he went back to his home country with the English language, with an American degree, and with money in his pocket, he would not only be going home, but he would also be playing a part in the country that he believed was going to be number one in the world, and that was his own country. So his ambition, or his routine from this moment on, was unvarying. He worked every day as a consultant from 7 until 5 or 5:30 in the afternoon. He would then have dinner with his wife, and at 6:30, he would drive down Connecticut Avenue with his technical manual for the following day's work, and he would park outside the restaurant that belonged to his friend, Mr. Chen. And if every half hour Mr. Chen came out with 2 plastic bags and said, deliver these to 1851 Columbia Road, Northwest Department 502, well, it was another $10 in tips, which he could add to the kitty he was building up to go to the country which Joseph Needham believed, and he believed, would ultimately be number one in the world, and that was his country, China. Thank you very much.
I would suggest to think with writing is just go on the lecture series. That is one terrific thought. It's just fascinating. Now because I gave you a shortened time, maybe you skipped kind of the war years, his time in China. Do you want to give us some more detail on that? And then I'll just open up short.
Yes, I mean his travels. I mean he borrowed a Chevrolet converted ambulance, and with 2 or 3 other people, one of whom is that chap called H.D. Huang, who was his driver and assistant, who lives in Alexandria, Virginia, and is 92 now, and still very bright old chap. He and other people then drove these expeditions. The one to Dunhuang took 7 months, and had the most extraordinary adventures. I mean, they're all chronicled in the book, and I could go on about them at great length. He became, in Chongqing, very much a friend of Zhou Enlai. He did not care for the nationalists one bit, and so, but of course he was intellectually and politically allied to the communists anyway. And his association with Mao, and with particularly Zhou Enlai, helped him get access to China, of course, in the post-war years and up to the time of his death, but also got him into a great deal of trouble politically back home, most notably when he accepted Zhou Enlai's urging the invitation to come in 1953 to head a scientific commission to inquire into whether the Americans had used biological weapons during the Korean War. And he wrote a report saying that they did. For that, he was excoriated in the British press, that he was banned from America for 25 years. He didn't get back to America until 1978, by which time he was already Master of Keys College, Cambridge, a towering figure in the academic world. But the legacy of McCarthyism remained. And there was an interesting coda to what happened when he did come back here. He came in April, I think it was 1978, to get an honorary degree from the University of Chicago, to give 3 lectures in Chicago. One of them, on the second lecture given on, I think, April the 4th, was on the origins of Chinese fragmentation bombs in the 7th century. And one of the, unbeknown to him, in the audience was a man called Ted Kaczynski, who 6 weeks later, using the very design that Needham had shown on the blackboard, created the first bomb that later his infamous career as the Unabomber. So one might argue that had the State Department continued the ban on Needham, the Unabomber would have had to have done something else.
Well, let me just say that he did one of the most remarkable thoughts.
Well, that's very nice, thank you.
Second, you should add more to the subject that Needham contributed to. It's seen in the volume 2, beginning around 588, how the remarkable text was out. More intrepidity. And many people recognized that years ago. Unfortunately, that has now retreated into history. But what I'm curious about is his work, which was prodigious, resting on a huge research base. Besides great job, whom did he have helping him? Despite his proclivity for learning languages, he couldn't possibly have got into the vast assemblage of literature required to master it in order to come up with the generalizations he did. Where was it now?
Well, a very valid question. An awful lot of his staff, and it was terribly informally assembled, were the young women that he and some of them have written, and they're always intelligent, and some of them went on to become, in their own right, very distinguished academics. Now, Francesca Bray, who many of you will know is an expert on Chinese agriculture and has just come back from, I think, Stanford or maybe Berkshire, and is now at Edinburgh, who wrote that poem, about Joseph's dancing skills. You better watch your Joseph and dance with Joseph. She was, I have to be careful what I say here because the libel laws in England, but nonetheless, she was very much, she felt a good young woman, Joseph felt. Under his tutelage, she flowered, became a considerable academic herself, and essentially single-handedly wrote the volume on early Chinese agriculture. And this pattern repeated itself many, many times. I mean, someone was talking a few moments ago about Stephen Hawking's sister, who was an early associate of Joseph. So there were lots and lots of young women. There were also very loyal men, of which H.T. Huang is a classic example down in Alexandria today, but they were informally assembled. He never had a formal team, and as to whether any of them was paid, no, they weren't, at least not in the early days.
Yeah. What is the answer to the Needham question?
Well, this is a far too bright an audience for me to read. I mean, in volume 7, part 2, which he wrote in 1994, just before he died, he attempted to answer, and he gave all the obvious suggested reasons. I mean, the Confucian examination system, which ensures that, the brightest young men in China do not study to become lawyers or chemists or engineers. They study to become bureaucrats to run China as she has always been run. Confucianism itself, the reference to age, means that most science is developed by younger people, that it's pushing the envelope. And if you're always respecting the elder, then you don't take these leaps in the dark, which science requires. And also the other side of the coin, look at what was happening in Europe at the 16th and 17th century, sort of the post-Renaissance sort of energy and all the internecine rivalry within Europe was causing a huge amount of technological innovation. But I think, quite honestly, nowadays, the feeling is that had Chinese science ended in 1650 and fallen off a cliff and had never developed again, then the Needham question was a very valid thing to ask. But what actually happened is ever since Deng Xiaoping was to get rich glorious speech and China's changed course pretty dramatically. I mean, I'm sure many of you have spent long periods that, I was at Fudan on Monday morning last in Shanghai. I mean, the quality of research coming out of these universities now is extraordinary. They're brimming with brains and ambition and money, and the number of patents being applied for in China is rising almost exponentially. It's going to be overtaking America very quickly. So it's as if suddenly China's back on the rails again. So from 1650, let's say, to 1990, let's say, 340 years. I mean, I know that's just higher than 150% of America's entire history, but it's less than 6% of China's history. So it's in the vast sweep of Chinese history, there was a period, a dark period when not very much happened. Well, that's almost a hiccup. And so perhaps the Needham question is moot. So needn't necessarily be answered, at least with the kind of urgency it was when it occurred to Needham 60 years ago.
Thank you.
You make a very interesting case in your book that it was falling in love with a Chinese woman that tipped him over into his life's work. What was it that tipped you over from journalism into writing books?
It's a very long but quite amusing story. I mean, I can tell it in 5 minutes if you like. Do you want me to? It's got nothing to do with China. But it is rather unusual. I'll tell you very briefly. I used to be a geologist. I was living in Uganda in 1966 and not a very good geologist at all, but read a book called Coronation Everest by a man called James Morris, who was the London Times correspondent on the Mount Everest expeditions that got to the top in 1953. And I wrote to him with all the sort of naivete of I was 21, I think, saying, "Dear Mr. Morris, I've just read this amazing book. I want to be you," basically. I mean, and he wrote a terribly kind letter back saying, "If you're serious, I mean, you'll never get particularly rich, you'll have a fascinating life. But my advice to you is if you think you can write, come back to England the day you receive this letter, not next week, not next month, the day you receive it, get a job on a local newspaper and write to me again." I did exactly that. I flew back from Entebbe to London that night. I'm sure my employers at Falcon Bridge of Africa were delighted to see me go because I'd been there to look for copper and I didn't find a microgram in the entire year. So I flew back and no one wanted to hire, I had all the arrogance to use an Oxford graduate, but no one wanted a geologist. But eventually someone did give me a job in Newcastle upon Tyne, whereupon I wrote to James again. By this time I had read all his books on Oxford and Venice and Spain and realized he was a very heavy hitter as a writer. So I wrote to him and I said, "Well, okay, here I am. I'm now a reporter. What now?" And in the reply, you could sense the sort of gulp that you took this advice. It's not exactly what I expected, but now you have. I'm going to give you 3 further bits of advice. Well, the third one of these 3 things he said was, every month parcel up the stories you're writing and send them to me at my house in North Wales. He lives in a village called Llanystumblw, where Lloyd George was born. And I will annotate them for you. And so, I mean, the stories that I wrote in those early days were, typical small town, 4 nuns in the Farcrest, none of that kind of thing. And I would send them off down to James in North Wales, and he would annotate them. This paragraph a little too long, this sentence a little dense, this verb infelicitously chosen, and slowly, the writing got a little bit better. But we never met. And I eventually was sent to Northern Ireland for 3 years and then to Washington, and I came here for Watergate and all that stuff. But in 1974, when Nixon had resigned and Ford had pardoned him on the 8th of September, Washington went quiet, and I decided to take 2 weeks holiday to go climbing, which was my big hobby, in North Wales. And I had a girlfriend at the time, an Australian woman who worked on the paper, and so I met her at Heathrow, and we rented a car and drove up the motorway. And she said on the way, "Doesn't your friend James Morris live in North Wales?" And I said, "Yes, but we've never met." And she said, "This is ridiculous. I mean, he's very proud of you. So when we get to the hotel, we must ring him up." And so I looked in the book, found his number, and I was terrified. I didn't want to. But she pressed the receiver to my ear, and I said, "Hi, it's Simon." And she said, "Well, this is wonderful. I read you every day from Washington. Where are you?" And I said, "I'm about 3 miles down the road at the Penny Girls Hotel." And he said, "Well, I'm thrilled. Come for tea tomorrow." So Jackie and I went climbing during that day, and they came down from the hills at about 3, drove to Llanystumblw, found this beautiful country house where James lived. And then there unfolded this bizarre scene that we parked the car, walked over the gravel, looked through the glass front door into a sort of ocean of the parquet flooring and nice oriental carpets, and we're filthy-filthy because we've been climbing. So I pressed the doorbell, and we're both kneeling down on the doorstep unlacing our climbing boots. And the door opens and a woman appears, and I look up and I say, "Hello, I'm Simon Winchester, this is Jackie Deason, you must be Mrs. Morris." And this person said, "No, I'm James, actually." And I thought this was a bit weird, but it was the 1970s and people grew their hair rather long. So I said, "Oh, well, you can never tell." And he said, "I'll get my wife." And I thought, no, this is really weird. I mean, the Welsh are a peculiar people anyway, so this is obviously just a joke. Because James, climbed Mount Everest, 35,000 feet. He had been a soldier, captain in the Brigade of Guards. He had fathered 4 children. He'd walked the lands like the Hadramawt. I mean, he was a man's man. So obviously whoever was coming down the stairs would have a beard and a Yukon Jack shirt or something. Not at all. Middle-aged lady with a little girl in tow, and we all go into the drawing room with me, obviously a man, and Jackie, obviously a young woman, and Elizabeth Morris, a middle-aged lady, and Suki, a 9-year-old girl. And my hero, James, with a twin set and pearls, a little Frenchie tucked into her sleeve, a tweed skirt, legs decoratively crossed, little court shoes, sizable accoutrements of womanhood. But of course, in Britain, nothing was said about this. She just sat there drinking our tea, and then afterwards, as we drove, Jackie, being a sport around Australia, said, "What was all that about?" And I said, "I have no idea at all." But the next morning, a letter was pushed under my door saying, "Dear Simon, I'm sorry to have put you through what must have been a somewhat awkward social situation. But the fact of the matter is that I've decided to become a woman, and I'm going to Casablanca next week to have the necessary surgery. If it all pans out, I'll be reborn as a woman. I'm taking the name Jan Morris. I hope you and I will be friends." Well, we've written a book together. We are the best of friends. I venture to say bosom buddies. And she was staying in New York with me 3 months ago. And then we were at the Shanghai Literary Festival last year. We're great, great friends. And so for years afterwards, the Guardian editors, whenever they got a letter from an aspirant reporter, how do I become a reporter on their newspaper? They said, it's very simple. You just go to Oxford, get a degree in geology, and befriend a transaction.
It's not a silent story, but it's a great.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I learned that you were in China recently, to promote your Chinese version of your book. I just wondering whether, I think I've read a little bit on the internet. I think that, I haven't read the book yet, but I think the quality of translation is pretty good, because I read whether the chapter headings are very Chinese, very elegant. So I know something about that. But I'm wondering whether your book has been accurately translated in Chinese.
That's a very good question.
Because there have been certain incidents in your book mentioned about the Needham's involvement in the Korea War was acted out by Chinese government, Russian government, to investigate into whether U.S. government had used the bacteria, in the Korea War. And I don't know whether that particular, session has been accurately translated. Which also led me to the second question, which is, you have access to a lot of archive material in Needham Research Institute and other places. How much access do you have to Chinese materials in Chinese archives?
Well,
I have the
question that is easier to answer is about the translation, because I don't read Chinese, and so I had no access to the Chinese archives at all. The translation that the publishers, it's published by an outfit called the Shanghai Scientific and Technological Literature Publishing House in Shanghai, was dreadful. But my friends in London who read Chinese said this is a bad translation, and that there's an academic called Liu Dun, who you probably know. Right, well, he did the translation in the end. He looked at the original SSTLPH translation and said, because we know each other, I want to try and preserve your voice, but also all of the incidents that you mentioned just now that are sensitive, the Chinese government said it's okay. So it's all in there, and as far as I'm told, and the big banquet last week, people said it's a superb translation. So I'm in no position to tell, but people that are say that it's extremely good.
Thank you for joining me at The Way We Live Now, a podcast where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration and talk about tools that will help to make the world a better place. I'd really love to have your ideas and comments. Please leave a comment below and subscribe to the feed. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I try to make a real letter, at karenchristensen.substack.com.